For the last 3 decades, the Indian economic narrative has been bulletproof. A GDP growth rate holding above 7%, a physical and digital infrastructure transformation of an unprecedented scale, and a stock market that absolutely refuses to cool down. On paper, India isn't just booming, it's an unstoppable macroeconomic juggernaut. But in early 2026, a geopolitical shock 3,000 miles away shattered that illusion. The sudden escalation of the Iran crisis and the subsequent blockade of the Strait of Hormuz didn't break the Indian economy. It did something much more revealing. It acted as an X-ray. When global supply chains choked and energy prices spiked, it exposed a terrifying paradox beneath the hood of the world's fastest growing nation. Despite trillions of rupees spent by the government on shiny new infrastructure, the actual physical gears of the Indian economy are misfiring. Private investment is stubbornly stagnant. Consumption among the working class is flatlining. And the manufacturing sector, which is supposed to be the engine of job creation, simply refuses to scale. So why is a country with so much capital and a massive demographic advantage struggling to get its real economic engine off the launch pad? Because while the state has spent the last decade upgrading India's hardware, its software is actively punishing the people trying to build it. To understand the urgency of this crisis, look at the unprecedented warning delivered recently by the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi.
देश हित में हमको ये तय करना पड़ेगा कि साल भर तक घर में कोई भी फंक्शन हो, कोई भी कार्यक्रम हो, हम सोने के गहने नहीं खरीदेंगे.
In a blunt public appeal, the government asked Indian families to do something unthinkable in Indian culture: voluntarily halt gold purchases for an entire year and tighten their belts. This isn't standard policy, it's the flashing red distress signal. The last time the Indian state felt this level of macroeconomic anxiety was during the 1991 balance of payments crisis, when the country was forced to physically airlift its gold reserves to London to avoid a default. Today, the fundamental math is similar. India is caught in a dual front foreign exchange trap, squeezed simultaneously by what it must import and where gold capital is fleeing to. First, look at the currency mechanics. India imports a staggering 85 to 90% of its crude oil. When the Iran crisis choked the Strait of Hormuz, global crude prices surged past $114 a barrel. But India cannot pay for oil in rupees. It must pay in US dollars. When your oil bill inflates by tens of billions, your demand for greenbacks skyrockets. To pay foreign suppliers, Indian banks must aggressively sell rupees to buy dollars. This massive structural imbalance triggers a textbook supply collapse. By mid-May 2026, the rupee fractured, breaching an all-time low of 96 to the dollar. This crash unleashed imported inflation. A weaker currency makes everything India buys from abroad drastically more expensive, from semiconductor components to agriculture fertilizers. To prevent a total currency freefall, the Reserve Bank of India has burned through over $30 billion in a matter of months just to artificially prop up the currency. This is exactly why the government is targeting gold. Gold is India's second largest import, consuming over $90 billion in capital annually. Unlike crude oil, which is a non-negotiable fuel for an industrial economy, gold is a luxury. To the central bank, every gram of gold bought for a wedding is a direct drain on finite dollar reserves. The state is begging its citizens to stop buying gold because it desperately needs to hoard cash to keep the lights on. But while India is bleeding dollars from its trade balance, a massive capital flight is happening out the back door. For a long time, India relied on foreign portfolio investors to pump liquidity into its stock market, balancing out its structural trade deficit. But in 2026, that foreign capital is rushing for the exits. Foreign investors have dumped an unprecedented 22 lakh crore or $21 billion of Indian equities this year alone, shattering historical records. Where this money is rushing to? It's fleeing directly into the United States to fund the multi-trillion-dollar artificial intelligence boom. Global fund managers look at the board and see that India completely lacks a dominant sovereign enterprise AI play. Its technology sector is still largely locked in low-margin IT services and legacy outsourcing. Faced with the choice between expensive Indian stock valuations and the exponential growth curve of American AI pioneers, global capital is making a cold calculated migration. They are liquidating Indian holdings, converting assets to dollars, and pouring them into Silicon Valley. This is the twin engine crisis stalling the Indian economic launchpad. The external energy shock drains dollar reserves from the outside, while the global tech migration siphons investment capital from the inside. But these global currents are merely symptoms. The real tragedy is that India's domestic system is so structurally choked that it cannot generate its own momentum to fight back. The moment global capital leaves the glossy boardrooms of Mumbai, it collides directly with the immovable object of the Indian state. To understand why the Indian economy is stalling today, you have to acknowledge what the Modi government has actually achieved since 2014. Because the physical transformation of the country is not political rhetoric, it is an objective reality. For the last decade, the Indian state has been executing one of the most aggressive infrastructure build-outs in human history. They decided to aggressively upgrade the country's hardware. Look at the railways. In 2014, only about 20% of India's massive rail network was electrified. The rest was running on slow, highly inefficient diesel. Today, in 2026, that number has hit 99.6%. In just over a decade, India electrified nearly 50,000 kilometers of track, practically eliminating its railway diesel dependence. Look at the roadways. The state pushed national highway construction to an absolute fever pitch, at its peak laying down an astonishing 37 kilometers of new access-controlled highways every single day. They built dedicated freight corridors, expanded port capacities, and pushed piped water and electricity into the deepest rural frontiers. In fact, you don't even need to look at government data to prove this happened. You can see it from space. If you look at India's luminosity maps from 2014 compared to today, the dark patches of the subcontinent have rapidly vanished. The sheer explosion of light over the last decade, especially over the Gangetic Plains, which are amongst the poorest parts of the country, proves that the concrete was poured, the grids were energized, and the hardware was successfully installed. But a modern economy is not just concrete and transmission lines. Hardware and electricity grids are useless if the legal and bureaucratic software running on top of them is deeply corrupted, and the software running the Indian economy is fundamentally broken. To understand why, we have to go back to 1991, the year India supposedly woke up. Before 1991, India operated under the infamous License Raj. The state controlled everything. A businessman had to get the government's permission to open a factory, permission to decide what to manufacture, and permission to set the price of the product. The bureaucracy viewed the private enterprise as a necessary evil that needed to be tightly controlled by at one point as much as 95% tax rate and endless red tape. Then came the 1991 financial crisis, and India was forced to liberalize. The common myth is that 1991 destroyed the License Raj and unleashed the Indian economic miracle. But that is a half-truth. The architects of the 1991 liberalization made a structural error. They liberalized the top of the economy, but they completely ignored the bottom. They opened the borders to foreign capital. They dismantled industrial licensing for massive conglomerates. They allowed billionaires to thrive and IT giants to build glittering campuses in places like Bangalore and Hyderabad. They liberalized the boardroom, but they completely forgot to liberalize the factory floor. At the local level, at the level of municipality, the district tax office, and the state labor department, the 1991 reforms never arrived. The License Raj didn't die. It mutated into the Inspector Raj. Today, a massive conglomerate can move billions of dollars of capital in and out of India with a keystroke. But if a middle-class entrepreneur wants to open a mid-sized manufacturing plant, they are thrown right back into the 70s. They are suddenly at the mercy of a predatory rent-taking bureaucracy. They are squeezed by local pollution boards, choked down by tax clerks, and harassed by labor inspectors. And the corruption isn't just a bug in the system, it is the core feature. The rules are kept deliberately complex and contradictory so that local bureaucrats can constantly threaten business owners with shutdowns or even jail time unless the price is paid. The government built a 21st century highway system, but they left a 20th century tollkeeper at every exit. And that is why private investment is dead on arrival, because capital is smart. It sees that the physical roads are paved, but the bureaucratic friction required to actually do business in India makes the journey impossible. If you look closely at the data, you begin to see a direct split in the Indian economic experience. At the center, there has been a genuine effort to digitize, formalize, and clean up the system. The national highways are built, corporate tax rates were rationalized, and moving capital internationally is smoother than ever. But manufacturing doesn't happen in the clouds. It happens on the ground. And at the state and municipality levels, the corruption is arguably worse than it was in the 1990s. To understand why, you have to look at how political power is distributed in India. In industrial powerhouses like the United States or China, power is heavily devolved to the cities. A mayor in a Chinese or US tech center has massive financial autonomy to build infrastructure, offer tax incentives, and clear the path for businesses. They compete with other cities for capital. India simply does not work this way. In India, power is ruthlessly hoarded by the state chief ministers. Cities which generate the overwhelming majority of India's GDP have practically zero political or financial autonomy. They are starved of funds and governed by state-appointed bureaucrats who have no direct accountability to the local economy. When power is centralized at the state level, but the actual friction of doing business happens at the local level, it creates a breeding ground for a deeply predatory tax and compliance structure. This is the system that economist Manish Sabharwal famously diagnosed as India's regulatory cholesterol. And the numbers behind this cholesterol are staggering. According to the research from Team Lease and the Observer Research Foundation, an Indian employer must navigate an incomprehensible labyrinth of regulations. But it's not just the volume of paperwork that kills entrepreneurship, it's the weaponization of the law. Out of the tens of thousands of compliance rules governing businesses in India, an estimated 26,000 of them carry jailable clauses. Let that number sink in. Over 26,000 different ways an entrepreneur can be thrown in a criminal prison for doing business. And these aren't just penalties for massive frauds or tax evasion. A business owner can face criminal charges and imprisonment for absurdly minor infractions. The hypercriminalization of business is not an accident, it is a feature. It is a highly engineered extortion mechanism. Because when the penalty for a typo is jail time, the local tax inspector, the labor officer, and the pollution control board hold the power of life and death over a factory. They routinely terrorize mid-sized businesses using the threat of these draconian laws to extract massive bribes. The compliance structure isn't designed to protect the worker or the environment. It is designed to create a toll booth for local bureaucrats. Now, in a functioning democracy, if a business is being extorted by a corrupt state officer, they turn to the courts. But in India, the justice system is the final trap. Judicial access for a mid-sized enterprise is practically non-existent. The Indian legal system is currently choking on a backlog of tens of millions of pending cases. If a factory owner decides to fight an unfair tax demand or an arbitrary closure notice, they are signing up for a legal battle that will outlast their business. It can take 5 to 10 years just to resolve a simple commercial dispute. Furthermore, there's a terrifying lack of consistency in how appellate tribunals and lower courts interpret commercial law. A tax ruling that favors a business in one state might be aggressively reversed in another, creating an environment of absolute legal unpredictability. When the local bureaucracy treats you like a criminal and the judicial system is too paralyzed to protect you, capital makes the only logical choice. It either flees the country, hides in the informal economy, or funnels entirely into the stock market. You cannot build the factory of the world when the state treats the factory owner as an enemy of the state. Now, every economic critique we have laid out on the surface converges into a single terrifying macroeconomic reality. India is running out of time. For years, the global consensus has been that India's ultimate economic superpower is its demographic dividend. With a median age of just 28, India possesses one of the youngest, largest pools of labor on the planet. The conventional narrative assumes that this youth bulge guarantees rapid growth for decades. But a demographic dividend is not an automatic inheritance. It is a highly time-sensitive window of opportunity. This demographic window is projected to peak around 2041. After that, the demographic momentum shifts. Because fertility rates across India have fallen below the replacement level of 2.1, the population will begin to age at an accelerating rate. This introduces the ultimate macro risk. India faces the distinct possibility of growing old before it gets rich. If an economy does not aggressively transition its population from low productivity agriculture into high productivity wealth generating sectors, while that population is young, it falls into the classic middle income trap, just as we have witnessed with economies like Brazil, Turkey, and South Africa. To break through that middle income ceiling, an economy must run on all cylinders. But right now, we are only looking at the surface level structural blockages. If you peel back the layers even further, you realize Indian economy undeniably possesses an extraordinary amount of latent potential. The digital infrastructure is world-class. The physical highways are paved, and the entrepreneurial ambition on the ground is palpable. But unlocking that potential so that the economy fires on all cylinders is the ultimate governance challenge. It cannot be achieved through public capital expenditure alone. It requires executing the far more complex, politically painful software reforms, completely dismantling the predatory local bureaucracy, purging the regulatory cholesterol that keeps the enterprises small, and radically restructuring a broken judicial system. The hardware miracle is complete, but until the state fixes the corrupted code running underneath it, India's true economic superpower will remain trapped on the launchpad.